The Fed is blinding itself on inflation. I recently mentioned how inflation is rising again despite Jerome Powell's best hopes and prayers. In fact, since October, annualized CPI went from under 1% to almost 2% in November, nearly 3% in December, and now almost 4% at 3.73%. And yet, the Fed has been silent. Why? Because they don't look at the CPI. They've got their own special number called the Personal Consumption Expenditure, or PCE, index, which is currently running a lot lower than CPI, as it almost always does. The problem is there's two big flaws with the PCE, which make it less accurate as well as artificially low, so the Fed is effectively blinding itself. Starting with accuracy, people read inflation as the cost to households, to the American people, as in, if CPI goes up 10%, stuff costs 10% more. The problem is the PCE includes government. This matters because government spends almost half of what's spent in this country, thanks to the income tax and the Fed itself. To illustrate, rent and housing make up 35% of what we spend. It makes up 35% of the CPI, but it's just 15% of the PCE. Why? Because it's diluted by the nearly $10 trillion spent on everything from migrants to Ukraine. This fake housing number alone is currently knocking 1% off the PCE index. Now multiply that across everything else, food, medical, cars, gas. Even bigger than who it measures is how PCE measures. In short, it updates too frequently to be accurate. So every price index has to decide how much weight to give things. If your rent and food double, but t-shirts and cat litter are 10% cheaper, how do you combine those? So they do this by making a basket where your consumer dollar is something like 35 cents of housing, 15 cents of food, 10 cents on the car, a half penny on t-shirts and cat litter. So far so good, but remember each category also has weights inside of it. So if milk, bread, or eggs double in price, that's a bigger deal than, say, cocktail olives doubling. That's where the magic happens, something called a substitution bias. To illustrate, what if you spend half your food on beef, or half your food budget on beef and half on chicken? You are hardcore keto. Now say beef doubles in price, but chicken stays the same. So you might stop buying beef and stick with chicken for a while. So what's your inflation rate? Well, if you use the old 50-50 weights, you got hit hard. Half of your food just doubled in price. But if you use the new weighting, where beef is 0% of your spend, there was no inflation. Nothing happened. This problem is built into all price indexes. Everything that went up shrinks in weight as people switch to substitutes. It's always a downward bias. The index underreports inflation. Because people avoid expensive things, they don't avoid cheap things. The more frequently you update the weights, the worse the bias gets. So naturally, the Fed chose the most biased one to work with. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained.com, governments universally manipulate statistics to hide the damage they caused. But the Fed doubled down, blinding themselves with the rosiest pair of glasses on the shelf. This raises the odds the Fed will ignore rising prices until, once again, they lose control. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.